My name is Bella. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my life, I've been the person people describe as steady. Not brilliant, not dramatic, not difficult, just steady. I live in a quiet suburb outside a mid-sized city in the United States. I work in financial operations for a regional healthcare network. Nothing flashy, nothing that makes for exciting dinner conversations. I balance budgets, reconcile discrepancies, and notice details most people overlook. It's meticulous work, invisible work, the kind that only gets attention when something goes wrong. That word, invisible, has followed me longer than I realized. In my family, I was the dependable one, the organized one, the one who remembered birthdays, coordinated holidays, helped my parents refinance their mortgage, reviewed insurance policies, and explained tax forms in plain English. My older brother, Daniel, was the charismatic one, the risk taker, the storyteller. People leaned in when he spoke. They trusted him instinctively. People didn't lean in when I spoke. They nodded. If you'd asked anyone who knew us to describe our dynamic, they would have said we balanced each other out, that I was good with numbers and Daniel was good with people. It sounded harmless, almost flattering, until the day he told our extended family that I had stolen money from them. He didn't accuse me directly at first. It was softer than that. A suggestion, a concern, a carefully phrased question about missing funds and oversight. He implied that because I handled certain financial paperwork for our parents, I had access and motive. What followed wasn't shouting, it wasn't dramatic, there were no slammed doors or explosive arguments. There were looks. There were silences that stretched just a little too long. There were conversations that happened without me. I didn't cry. I didn't defend myself loudly. I didn't send angry texts. I did what I've always done. I asked for the numbers. Specifically, I requested a full forensic audit of every shared account, transfer, and financial document tied to our family. Daniel thought that was unnecessary, excessive, hurtful, even. He didn't expect his name to surface. This isn't a story about revenge. I didn't scream. I didn't ruin anyone publicly. I didn't orchestrate a dramatic takedown. This is a story about perception, about what happens when someone mistakes your quiet for weakness, about what shifts inside you when you realize that being underestimated can become leverage. Over the next hour, I'm going to walk you through how the rumor began, why I stayed silent longer than I should have, and what really happens when truth is documented instead of argued. I won't exaggerate. I won't villainize. I'll just tell you what I saw, what I learned, and what it cost. Have you ever noticed how easily people question the quiet one? In my family, I was the system, not the spotlight, not the spark, the system. If something needed organizing, I did it. If paperwork needed reviewing, I handled it. When my parents started feeling overwhelmed by medical bills, refinancing options, and retirement projections, I built them a spreadsheet that tracked everything from prescription costs to projected long-term care. No one applauded that. They just expected it next time. Daniel, my older brother by 3 years, was different. He could walk into a room and leave with 3 new contacts and a dinner invitation. He was persuasive without seeming aggressive, warm without seeming needy. He told stories in a way that made people feel chosen for hearing them. I explained compound interest at Thanksgiving. It sounds like I'm resentful. I'm not. At least, I wasn't. For most of my life, I genuinely believed our roles were complementary. He opened doors. I made sure the hinges didn't fall off. When our parents began slowing down, those roles intensified. I coordinated their insurance transitions. I met with their financial advisor and translated his jargon into something practical. I set up online access for accounts that they didn't know how to navigate. With their permission, I became the point person for statements and payment confirmations. It wasn't a secret arrangement. It was discussed at the kitchen table. Daniel was there. He said, "Bella's the number one. Let her handle it." Everyone nodded, and that was that. But here's what I slowly began to understand. When you're the number one, people also assume you're the one capable of manipulating numbers. It started subtly, a comment here and there. "Bella probably knows where every dollar goes. Careful, she's the accountant," said with a laugh. said with admiration. But repetition changes tone. At family gatherings, if a bill was higher than expected, someone would glance at me. Jokingly, they'd say. If an investment underperformed, I'd get the quiet look, as though markets responded to my personal instructions. Daniel would smile through those moments. He never corrected anyone. He never reinforced the joke either. He just let it hover in the air. I told myself it was harmless. I was stable. I had a steady career. I wasn't flashy, but I wasn't insecure either. I had my own condo, my own savings, my own peace. What I didn't realize was how easily a role can calcify. Reliable becomes responsible. Responsible becomes accountable. Accountable becomes suspect. By the time our parents decided to restructure part of their retirement portfolio into a family-managed trust to simplify inheritance and reduce taxes, I was the obvious choice to liaise with the legal team. I didn't control the funds, I didn't have discretionary spending authority, but I had access to documentation. Access, in hindsight, was enough. If you had asked me then how my family saw me, I would have said dependable, logical, slightly boring. I would not have said expendable. But when rumors began to circulate months later, quiet ones, cautious ones, I realized something chilling. In a room full of personalities, charisma often outranks documentation. And I had documentation, but I hadn't yet learned how to use it. The first time I felt it, it wasn't loud. It was a Sunday afternoon at my parents' house. The kind of afternoon that smelled like roast chicken and furniture polish. My mother was setting out plates, my father was half watching a golf tournament, and Daniel was leaning against the kitchen counter telling a story about a potential business expansion he was considering. He was in high spirits. He usually was. Somewhere between dessert and coffee, my aunt mentioned that she'd heard there had been some confusion about a transfer related to the family trust. She said it gently, almost apologetically. I looked up. "What confusion?" I asked. She hesitated. "Oh, it's probably nothing. Daniel just mentioned something about a delay. Maybe a misallocation?" The word hung in the air, misallocation. Daniel didn't look at me immediately. He took a sip of coffee first. Calm, casual. "Yeah," he said lightly. "There was just a weird timing issue. One of the internal transfers didn't show up when we expected. Probably a processing delay, but you know how these things are." He smiled at me then. "You'd know better than anyone, Bella." The table chuckled. I nodded slowly. "I can check the transaction logs," I said. "Which transfer are we talking about?" He waved his hand dismissively. "It's handled. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it." That sentence did something subtle inside me. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. As if he had chosen grace. As if there had been something to make a big deal about. I let it go in the moment. I even smiled. Later that evening, when I got home, I logged into the account system. I reviewed every transfer from the previous quarter, dates, timestamps, authorizations, confirmations. There was no misallocation. There had been a 2-day processing delay from the receiving bank. Documented, time-stamped, automated confirmation email included. Normal. I drafted a short, neutral message to Daniel. "Reviewed the Q2 transfer you mentioned. It was posted with a standard processing delay of 2 business days. Everything reconciles correctly. Let me know if you're seeing something different." He replied 3 hours later. "Got it. Probably nothing then. Thanks." No apology, no clarification to the family group chat, no correction to my aunt. That was the first small cut. It wasn't the implication itself that unsettled me. It was the way it had been introduced. Publicly, but vaguely. Concern without accusation, suspicion without responsibility. And more than that, it was the realization that everyone at that table had accepted the premise without question. Of course, Bella would know. Of course, Bella had access. Of course, Bella might have information. No one asked Daniel for specifics. No one asked to see documentation. The room had simply absorbed the suggestion and moved on. I told myself I was overthinking it. Families miscommunicate. Financial processes are confusing. Daniel probably mentioned it casually and didn't realize how it sounded. Still, something shifted in my awareness. A week later, my cousin asked me, almost jokingly, "Hey, you're not skimming off the top of Grandma's future inheritance, right?" He laughed immediately after saying it, but he said it. And jokes are rarely born from nowhere. That night, I didn't just check the accounts, I downloaded them. Every statement, every authorization record, every email confirmation is tied to the trust. Not because I felt guilty, because I felt watched. And I couldn't yet tell whether the watching was curiosity or preparation. The strange thing about quiet suspicion is that it doesn't arrive as a storm. It arrives as weather. It becomes the air in the room. After that Sunday, no one confronted me directly. No one accused me outright. But small shifts began accumulating, so subtle that if you pointed them out, you'd sound defensive. Daniel started asking more questions in group settings. "Hey, Bella, can you remind us how much is in the discretionary portion of the trust again?" I would answer. "And who has authorization to move funds?" I would explain. "And there's no way for, say, internal transfers to be overlooked?" He'd phrase it lightly, hypothetically, the tone of someone brainstorming, not accusing. Everyone would look at me expectantly, waiting for reassurance, and I would give it, calmly, factually, without irritation, because irritation would look like guilt. That's how normalization works. It convinces you that responding to suspicion is your responsibility. At first, I rationalized it. Daniel was under stress. His business ventures weren't stabilizing the way he'd hoped. He had recently mentioned cash flow issues, though not in detail. Maybe he was just anxious about money in general. Maybe he needed reassurance, and I could provide reassurance, but reassurance is different from defense. I began noticing that conversations about finances were increasingly held without me, and then summarized to me afterward. Daniel said we might need to review oversight procedures. Oversight? I'd ask. Just in general, to protect everyone. Protect everyone from what? No one could articulate it clearly. It was always vague, always framed as a collective concern. One evening, my mother called me. She sounded tired. "Sweetheart," she began gently, "Daniel mentioned that maybe we should consider having an external review of the accounts, just to avoid misunderstandings." "Misunderstandings about what?" I asked. "Oh, nothing specific. Just, you know how families can be." I did know. Families can be loyal until someone suggests they shouldn't be. "Do you think I've mishandled anything?" I asked her, not accusingly, just plain. There was a pause. "I don't think you would," she said carefully, "but perception matters." Perception. That word lodged itself under my ribs. I wasn't being evaluated on evidence. I was being evaluated on how things looked. And apparently, things looked questionable. The irony was almost clinical. I had built the entire system to be transparent. Shared drive folders, dual authorization processes, clear audit trails. But transparency only works if people look at it. If they don't, narrative fills the space. Daniel wasn't attacking me, not overtly. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't demanding access or making threats. He was doing something far more effective. He was asking questions, repeatedly, publicly, calmly. And each time I answered, I reinforced the idea that I was accountable for defending myself. That's when I realized something uncomfortable. I had been so focused on being correct that I hadn't considered being protected. Documentation existed, but documentation unused is just paper. One night, sitting alone at my dining table with my laptop open and transaction logs glowing softly in the dark, I asked myself a question I'd never asked before. Why am I the only one explaining? And more importantly, who benefits from that? There's a moment in every long-standing dynamic where you realize the role you're playing wasn't chosen. It was assigned. I began to see it clearly at my parents' anniversary dinner. It was supposed to be simple, just immediate family at a quiet restaurant. I had made the reservation, coordinated the gift, and even confirmed dietary restrictions. Daniel arrived 20 minutes late, charming as ever, carrying a last-minute bouquet and a louder energy than the room required. By dessert, conversation drifted inevitably toward finances. My father mentioned the trust again. Something about long-term distribution timelines. Before I could respond, Daniel leaned back in his chair and said lightly, "Well, that's Bella's department. She's the gatekeeper." Gatekeeper. The word landed heavier than it should have. I smiled because that's what I do in public spaces. "Not a gatekeeper," I corrected gently. "Just the coordinator. Everything still requires dual authorization." Daniel nodded slowly. Right, of course, transparency. It wasn't what he said. It was the cadence. the slight emphasis, as if the word transparency needed reinforcement. I looked around the table. My mother avoided eye contact. My father cleared his throat. No one challenged the framing, and suddenly I understood something with uncomfortable clarity. In their minds, I wasn't just helpful. I was the firewall, the one standing between access and approval, the one who could say no. And when you're the person who can say no, even if you rarely do, you become a convenient focal point for frustration. Daniel had positioned himself differently. He wasn't the gatekeeper, he was the advocate, the one asking questions, the one making sure everyone feels secure, which meant I was the obstacle to that security. The role had shifted from dependable to restrictive, from organized to controlling, and I hadn't noticed when it happened. After dinner, as we stood outside the restaurant waiting for the valet, Daniel stepped closer to me. His voice lowered just enough to feel private, but not intimate. "You know," he said casually, "sometimes you come across a little rigid. People just want to feel included." "Included in what?" I asked. "Information, decisions, movement." "There is no movement without documentation," I replied. He smiled, almost pitying. "That's what I mean." For the first time, I saw it plainly. He wasn't confused about the finances. He was reframing the narrative. In his version, I wasn't protecting the family's assets. I was limiting access. I drove home that night with a strange calm settling in. Not anger, not even hurt. Recognition. The role I had accepted, reliable, useful, invisible, had evolved without my consent. Now I was the quiet authority figure, the technical barrier, the person whose silence could be interpreted as concealment. And here's what I finally understood. If something ever went wrong, or appeared to go wrong, I was already prepositioned to absorb blame. Not because I had done anything, but because the story had been gently rehearsed. Bella manages the money. Bella has access. Bella doesn't explain enough. The script was subtle, but it was consistent. And once you see a script, you can't unsee it. That night, I took out my black leather portfolio, the one I use for work, and placed inside it copies of every authorization agreement, every meeting summary, every signed document, not defensively, deliberately. If I were going to carry a role, I would at least understand the stage. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen when someone accused me directly. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in complete silence. I was at my office reviewing quarterly reconciliation reports for work when my phone buzzed. It was a message from a cousin I rarely spoke to one-on-one. "Hey, random question. Is everything okay with the family accounts? Just heard some stuff and wanted to check." He added a smiley face at the end, as if that softened it. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. He didn't specify what he'd heard. He didn't accuse me. But the question itself confirmed something I had been quietly resisting. The rumor had moved beyond the immediate family. It was circulating. I typed back, "Everything is fully documented and reconciled. If you ever want to review anything directly, I'm happy to share statements." He didn't respond for hours. When he finally did, it was brief. "Oh, okay, good to know." Good to know. Not, "Sorry for asking." Not, "I'm sure it's nothing." Just confirmation that the idea of possible mismanagement had traveled far enough to warrant private inquiries. That's when something inside me settled, not in fear, but in clarity. I realized I had been reacting, answering questions, providing reassurance, clarifying tone. But I had not yet defined the situation. I left work early that day and drove straight to my parents' house. I didn't announce it in advance. I didn't prepare a speech. I just asked my mother if we could sit at the kitchen table. "I need to ask you something directly," I said. She looked nervous immediately. That told me more than any rumor. "Do you believe I've mishandled your money?" Her eyes widened. "Of course not." "Do you believe I would?" "No." "Then why are other people unsure?" She hesitated. "Daniel is just concerned," she said carefully. "He thinks the structure might be too centralized." "Centralized around me?" I asked. She didn't answer. There it was. The narrative wasn't that I had stolen anything. It was what I could. And that possibility had been emphasized enough times to grow roots. I nodded slowly. "I think it's time for a formal review," I said. Her face tightened. "Bella, that sounds so serious." "It is serious." "Are you upset?" I surprised myself by answering honestly. "No, I'm done explaining." That was the shift. Not anger, not retaliation. Precision. I drove home and opened my laptop. Instead of reviewing statements defensively, I researched forensic auditing firms, independent, credentialed, external. If perception was the issue, then perception needed structure. I wasn't going to argue my innocence at dinner tables. I was going to document it beyond question. And quietly, without announcing it in the family group chat, I sent a formal inquiry to a certified forensic accounting firm. I attached the trust documents, authorization agreements, full access logs. I didn't accuse anyone. I simply wrote, I would like a comprehensive forensic audit of all transactions associated with the Whitmore Family Trust since inception. No emotion, no context. Just a request. Because the moment you realize your integrity is being evaluated by implication, you stop defending your character. You start securing it. That night, I slept better than I had in months. Not because the problem was solved, but because for the first time, I wasn't reacting to the narrative. I was designing the outcome. After I hired the forensic firm, I told no one. Not Daniel, not my cousins, not even my parents yet. The audit would take time. Weeks, possibly longer. Data collection, transaction tracing, cross-referencing authorizations. It wasn't dramatic, it was procedural. And procedure, I've learned, is quieter than emotion. In the meantime, I changed nothing externally. I still answered questions calmly. I still attended Sunday dinners. I still forwarded monthly summaries to the shared family drive. But internally, something fundamental had shifted. My silence was no longer compliance. It was a strategy. Daniel, however, seemed to interpret it differently. Without my usual proactive explanations, he began filling the space. At one dinner, he casually mentioned that he'd been looking into alternative oversight models. Another time, he suggested that perhaps the trust should require additional internal approvals for transparency. He never directly accused me. He didn't need to. Each comment reinforced the premise that oversight was lacking, even though every transaction required dual authorization already. What he didn't realize was that I had stopped defending. When he asked, "Are you okay with more visibility?" I responded simply, "I welcome it." No elaboration. When he suggested, "Maybe we should have someone review the books at some point," I nodded. "That's reasonable?" He studied my face during those moments, as if waiting for irritation, resistance, fear. He didn't find any, and that unsettled him more than if I had argued. Silence, when chosen deliberately, has weight. But I wasn't just being quiet socially. I was documenting everything. Every comment about oversight, every suggestion is framed as a concern. Every email implies ambiguity, not to build a case against him, to build a timeline. Because rumors don't start with accusations, they start with positioning, and positioning leaves patterns. At work, I found myself unusually focused. Reconciling hospital budgets felt almost meditative. Numbers don't speculate. They align or they don't. In contrast, family conversations had become speculative by design. One evening, Daniel called me directly. "I just want to make sure we're good," he said. "We're good," I replied. "You've seemed distant." "I'm just busy." There was a pause. "You know no one's attacking you, right?" The phrasing was careful. I let the silence stretch just long enough. "I haven't said anyone was." He exhaled lightly, almost a laugh. "Okay, just checking." What struck me was not his tone. It was his need to check. He was measuring my reaction, trying to assess whether his narrative was landing. What he didn't know was that the landing zone had already been prepared somewhere else. The forensic firm had begun pulling full transaction histories. They requested access logs not just from the trust accounts, but from linked personal transfers that interacted with them. Standard procedure. Comprehensive review. I approved everything. Because silence, when backed by documentation, isn't weakness. It's containment. And containment is calm. By the end of the third week, something subtle changed in the atmosphere. People stopped asking me questions directly. Instead, they asked Daniel. I could tell from how conversations were summarized later. It seemed he had positioned himself as the intermediary, the concerned party, the protective son. The brother is ensuring fairness. And for the first time, I stopped wondering whether that was accidental. Silence had given me clarity. Not about the money, about the motive. What they never noticed was that I had stopped participating emotionally. Not withdrawn, not cold, just observant. When you remove yourself from the need to defend, you start seeing patterns more clearly. The forensic firm assigned to the review was discreet. credentialed, unaffiliated with anyone in our personal network. They began by requesting something I hadn't anticipated: a full relational map of all accounts connected to the trust. Not just the trust itself, any account that had interacted with it: direct transfers, reimbursements, temporary holding accounts, linked investment vehicles. It was standard practice. Follow the flow of funds. I provided everything I had access to. What I didn't control, they requested directly through legal channels. Using the authorization structure embedded in the trust agreement, every beneficiary had consented years earlier to independent review if needed. No one had expected it to be used. I didn't announce the audit. I didn't hint at it. I simply let the process unfold. Meanwhile, I paid closer attention to Daniel. He had become increasingly vocal about modernizing our family's financial structure. He floated ideas about liquidity options, suggested short-term reallocations, spoke about opportunity cost with unusual frequency. At one Sunday dinner, he mentioned a potential investment he had been exploring: a private venture, high upside, short window. It would be easier, he said casually, if we had more flexibility with the trust distributions. I looked at him evenly. The trust is structured for preservation, not speculation, I replied. He smiled. Everything's speculation, Bella, even preservation. That was the first time I heard impatience in his voice. Not anger, impatience, as if the existing structure was inconvenient. I didn't argue. I didn't lecture. I simply made a mental note. Because here's what they never noticed. While Daniel was reframing narratives publicly, I was reconstructing timelines privately. I reviewed historical meeting notes from when the trust was first established. I revisited email threads from the restructuring phase. I compared verbal suggestions made in the last 6 months to documented permissions granted years ago. Patterns began aligning. Certain proposals Daniel had recently introduced, temporary reallocation, accelerated distribution options, bridge loans against projected inheritance, had been subtly rejected during the initial planning stages. Rejected for risk. At the time, he had agreed. Now, he was resurfacing them under the language of fairness and modernization. The forensic team reached out midway through week 4. They needed clarification on a series of small transfers made over several months, amounts individually insignificant, administrative-looking, categorized as reimbursement adjustments. I reviewed the list. They weren't initiated by me. They weren't authorized by my credentials. They were dual authorized, yes, but the secondary credential attached to those approvals wasn't mine. It was Daniel's. That didn't mean wrongdoing. Not yet. Beneficiaries were allowed limited reimbursement under specific conditions, but frequency matters. Pattern matters. And what struck me most wasn't the amounts. It was the direction. Funds had flowed temporarily into a short-term holding account before being redistributed. The holding account wasn't part of the original trust structure. It was linked to a business entity I recognized. Daniel's newest venture. I didn't react emotionally. I asked the auditors a single question. Were all disclosures made in alignment with trust reporting requirements? There was a pause on the line. That's what we're verifying, they said carefully. That night, I sat at my dining table with my black leather portfolio open in front of me. For months, I had been subtly positioned as the potential risk, the gatekeeper, the one with access. But access leaves fingerprints, and fingerprints don't respond to rumors. They respond to forensic review. For the first time, I understood something with complete clarity. This wasn't about misunderstanding. It was about liquidity, and liquidity requires narrative cover. The silence I had chosen wasn't just strategic anymore. It was protective. Not the money, of the truth. The call came on a Thursday morning. I was at work, midway through reconciling a departmental variance report, when my phone lit up with the forensic firm's number. I let it ring once before answering, not to appear hesitant, just to steady my breathing. Bella, the lead auditor began, voice even and professional. We've completed the preliminary trace. Preliminary. Not final, not accusatory, just factual. They walked me through it step by step. Dates, amounts, authorization chains, cross-account transfers. The language was neutral, almost clinical. Over the past 9 months, a series of small reimbursements had been initiated under allowable beneficiary provisions. Individually, they fell within policy thresholds. none large enough to trigger automatic review. But collectively, they formed a pattern. Funds were temporarily routed into an external business operating account tied to Daniel's venture. From there, they were redistributed, sometimes back into the trust, sometimes offset against what were labeled anticipated distributions. Anticipated, a word that doesn't exist in a preservation trust. Were these transactions disclosed in quarterly summaries? I asked. Not in a way that would clearly reflect the interim routing, the auditor replied. Again, careful language. They weren't saying fraud. They weren't saying theft. They were saying the structure had been used creatively. Does this constitute a violation? I asked. There are compliance concerns, he said, specifically regarding beneficiary fiduciary expectations and disclosure accuracy. Translation: he had leveraged access. And while I had been answering dinner table questions about transparency, Daniel had been quietly moving funds under the cover of procedural legitimacy. I didn't feel anger. I felt confirmation. The narrative suddenly made sense. If funds were temporarily redirected and liquidity tightened, suspicion needed a decoy. Who better than the gatekeeper with access? Who better than the quiet one who wouldn't shout back? He didn't expect his name to surface. The auditor continued outlining the next steps: full written report, recommendations, options. One option involved internal correction and formal disclosure to all beneficiaries. Another involved escalating to legal review for breach of fiduciary duty. Both were irreversible in different ways. I thanked them and ended the call. Then I sat still. Not celebrating, not spiraling, just recalibrating. Because here's the truth: discovery is not victory. Discovery is a responsibility. If I revealed the findings immediately, it would fracture the family. If I concealed them, I would become complicit in the very opacity I had been accused of. I opened my black leather portfolio and placed the preliminary summary inside. For months, I had been positioned as the risk. Now I held clarity. Not gossip, not suspicion. Evidence. And evidence has weight. That evening, Daniel texted me. Hey, any update on that oversight idea we talked about? I stared at the message. Oversight. I typed back, I'm working on something comprehensive. Which was true. He responded with a thumbs up emoji. Casual. Unaware. For the first time in this entire process, I understood the asymmetry. He believed narrative could outpace documentation. He believed suggestion was enough. What he didn't anticipate was that forensic review doesn't follow the suggestion. It follows trails. And trails don't care about charisma. I closed my laptop that night without messaging anyone else. No confrontation, no warning, just a decision forming quietly in my chest. Not about exposing him, about correcting the record. Permanently. Clarity is heavy, not because it's confusing, but because it removes excuses. Once I had the preliminary findings in writing, I spent 3 days doing nothing externally. I went to work, I answered emails, I sent my parents their usual monthly summary. Internally, I weighed options. Option 1, call Daniel privately. Show him the report. Give him a chance to self-disclose. Quiet correction, minimal fallout. Option 2, present the findings to my parents only. Contain the damage. Let them decide whether to escalate. Option 3, trigger the formal clause embedded in the trust agreement. Mandatory disclosure to all beneficiaries upon forensic finding of compliance irregularities. The irreversible one. Each option carried consequences. If I confronted Daniel privately, he could frame it as a misunderstanding, a technical error, a liquidity timing issue, and he would likely apologize strategically, perhaps even repay or reclassify the funds. But the narrative he had seeded about me would remain quietly unresolved. There would be no public correction, just a quiet reset. If I told only my parents, I would protect them from shock, but also burden them with a choice between their children. If I triggered full disclosure, I would remove interpretation entirely. Facts would circulate the same way rumors had, documented, time-stamped, unemotional. But once sent, it couldn't be unsent. I sat at my dining table with the full draft report open in front of me. The auditors had completed their comprehensive review. The language was precise. Pattern of interim fund redirection inconsistent with stated preservation objectives. Insufficient beneficiary disclosure. Material compliance concern. No dramatic accusations. just alignment between action and documentation. I realized something in that moment that surprised me. This wasn't about punishment, it was about narrative control. For months, Daniel had asked questions publicly and positioned me as opaque. If I chose private resolution, the family would never see the contrast between suggestion and evidence. The story would quietly fade, but the doubt would remain faintly attached to my name. And I understood something about doubt. If you don't remove it fully, it resurfaces later. So I asked myself the only question that mattered. What outcome allows me to never defend myself again? The answer wasn't emotional. It was structural. Full disclosure. Not framed as an accusation, not dramatized. Simply the activation of a clause everyone had agreed to years earlier. I emailed the auditors. Please proceed with formal beneficiary disclosure under Section 8.4 of the Whitmore Family Trust Agreement. Include complete transaction trace and compliance summary. My finger hovered over send for exactly 3 seconds. Not because I was unsure, because I knew once I pressed it, the dynamic would permanently shift. Then I sent it. No announcement, no warning, just process. An hour later, Daniel called. I didn't answer. Not out of fear, out of sequence. He didn't yet know why he was calling. But he would. And for the first time since the rumors began, I felt something unfamiliar. Not relief. Finality. The disclosure didn't go out immediately. There's a formal rhythm to these things. The forensic firm finalized the report, attached supporting documentation, and prepared a neutral cover letter citing the activation of Section 8.4, mandatory beneficiary disclosure following identified compliance irregularities. No adjectives, no emotional framing, just procedure. While they prepared it, I continued as if nothing had changed. Sunday dinner came and went. Daniel talked about market volatility. My father nodded along. My mother asked me whether I considered bringing in someone external for peace of mind. I have, I said calmly. Daniel glanced at me, searching my face for context. I offered none. He smiled faintly. Good, transparency helps everyone. It does, I agreed. And that was the last normal conversation we had. The following Wednesday at 9 a.m., every listed beneficiary of the Whitmore Family Trust received the same email. Subject line, Formal Compliance Review Summary. Whitmore Family Trust. Attached, 47 pages. Transaction logs. Authorization records. Flow diagrams tracing interim fund redirection from trust to external operating account. Disclosure comparison charts. His name appeared 17 times. Not highlighted, not emphasized. Just present. I was at my office when my phone began vibrating. First, my cousin. Then my aunt. Then my mother. I let them all go to voicemail. Not to avoid them, but to let the documents speak first. Narratives lose power when facts circulate simultaneously. By noon, Daniel's name had been seen. By 12:15, the pattern had been understood. By 12:30, my mother called again. This time I answered. Her voice was tight. Bella, what is this? It's the independent review you suggested we consider, I replied evenly. There was silence on the other end. Did you know? She asked quietly. I knew there were compliance concerns, I said. I didn't know the full scope until the audit was complete. That was true. Daniel texted me around 1 p.m. Call me now. No greeting. No punctuation beyond urgency. I didn't respond. At 2 p.m., he emailed the entire family. The tone was controlled but strained. He described the transfers as temporary liquidity management. He emphasized that no funds were permanently removed. He characterized the disclosure as procedural overreach. Overreach. I read his email twice. He wasn't denying the transactions. He was reframing intention. But intention isn't the same as authorization. By late afternoon, something shifted in the group dynamic. No one was asking me questions anymore. They were asking him, when had this begun? Why wasn't it disclosed? Why was an external business account involved? The same calm, repetitive questioning he had once used in my direction had rotated toward him. I didn't participate. I didn't respond to all. I went home, placed a printed copy of the final report into my black leather portfolio, and set it on my desk. Silence, I've learned, is most powerful after truth circulates. That evening, Daniel called again. This time, his voice wasn't measured. Did you have to do this publicly? He asked. I followed the trust agreement, I said. You could have come to me. You could have disclosed the transfers. He exhaled sharply. It wasn't theft. I didn't call it theft. Another pause. For months, I had been subtly positioned as the potential risk. Now documentation had repositioned him, not as a villain, as accountable. And accountability feels abrupt when you're not expecting it. The first consequence wasn't loud. It was an absence. Sunday dinner was canceled that week. No dramatic explanation, just a short message from my mother. Let's take a little time. Time. That word can mean healing or fallout. In the family group chat, conversation slowed to logistical fragments. No jokes, no forwarded articles, no casual updates. Silence had moved, but this time it wasn't mine. Daniel sent a longer email 2 days after the disclosure. He clarified that the funds had always been intended as short-term reallocations. He attached partial repayment confirmations. He emphasized that nothing had been lost. No one accused him of loss. The issue wasn't disappearance. It was a disclosure. Liquidity had been prioritized over transparency. And transparency had been the very standard used to question me. I noticed something else shifting quietly. The tone toward me changed. Not apologetic. Careful. My aunt called and said, "We probably should have asked more questions before." She didn't finish the sentence. Before what? Before implying, before assuming? She didn't need to. My cousin texted, "I didn't realize how structured everything actually was. That report was thorough." Thorough. The same meticulous quality once described as rigid was now reassuring. At work, I found myself more composed than I expected. There was no gloating, no surge of indication, just steadiness. Because consequences are rarely cinematic. They're relational. Daniel's business partner was listed in the transaction trace. That meant the audit report had reached beyond family inboxes. Legal compliance requires notification to any entity materially connected to trust funds. By the end of the week, I heard, indirectly, that one of his pending investment deals had stalled, not collapsed, paused. Investors prefer clean narratives, and forensic attachments complicate narratives. My father called me late one evening. His voice sounded older than usual. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" he asked. "I didn't know sooner," I replied, "that he was moving money." "I suspected irregularity," I said carefully. "I didn't assume motive." There was a long pause. "I thought you two were aligned," he said quietly. "So did I." That was the unspoken fracture. This wasn't just about funds. It was about roles. For months, Daniel had positioned himself as protector of family interests. Now documentation suggested he had prioritized opportunity over agreement. And while nothing illegal had occurred, no dramatic embezzlement, no vanished assets, the trust agreement had been treated as flexible. Flexible structures create flexible trust. That's the real consequence. Not punishment, erosion. What unsettled Daniel most wasn't financial. It was positional. He was no longer the one asking the careful questions. He was answering them, and answering is heavier. One afternoon, my mother forwarded me a message Daniel had sent her privately. I wasn't meant to see it, I think, but she wanted perspective. He wrote, "Bella escalated this unnecessarily. It could have been handled internally." I read that line twice. Internally, meaning quietly. Meaning without record. Meaning without the same public scrutiny I had endured. I handed the phone back to my mother and said gently, "I followed the structure we all agreed to." She nodded. But she looked tired. Consequences don't explode. They redistribute weight. And now that weight was no longer sitting solely on my shoulders. Panic doesn't always look frantic. Sometimes it looks persuasive. About 10 days after the disclosure, Daniel asked to meet in person. Not at our parents' house, not at a restaurant, at my condo. Neutral ground. I agreed. He arrived without his usual ease. No animated greeting, no story to soften the room. He stood in my living room for a moment as if recalibrating how to enter it. "You blindsided me," he said finally. "I activated a clause," I replied. "You made it look like I was siphoning money. The report reflects routing and disclosure gaps. It doesn't assign motive." That's semantics. It's documentation. He paced once across the room, then stopped. "You could have called me," he repeated. "And what would have changed?" I asked. "I would have explained. You had 9 months to explain in quarterly summaries." He opened his mouth, then closed it. That was the first time I saw something unfamiliar in him. Not anger, not arrogance, exposure. "I was going to put it back," he said quietly. "You did put most of it back. That's not the point." "I agree," I said. The silence between us wasn't hostile. It was structural. The foundation of our dynamic had shifted, and both of us could feel it settling into a new shape. "You didn't have to humiliate me," he said. "I didn't mention your name," I replied calmly. "The report listed authorization credentials." "That's the same thing." "No," I said softly, "it's not. Humiliation requires spectacle. This had been procedural, but the procedure can feel merciless when you're unprepared for it." He sat down finally, leaning forward with his hands clasped. "I was under pressure," he admitted. "The business needed short-term capital. I thought it was temporary and technically allowed under beneficiary reimbursement." "Technically allowed requires transparent reporting," I said. He nodded reluctantly. "I didn't think it would matter." "That's the problem." He looked up at me then, searching my face. "You've changed," he said. "I considered that." "No," I answered. "I stopped compensating. For years I had absorbed doubt quietly, clarified gently, over-explained preemptively. This time I let structure speak. "You've damaged my credibility," he said. I met his gaze evenly. "You questioned mine first." There it was. Not shouted, not dramatized. Just acknowledged. He leaned back, exhaling. "So what now?" he asked. "The trust will likely implement stricter authorization controls," I said. "Independent quarterly reviews, possibly removal of discretionary beneficiary routing." His jaw tightened slightly. Those controls would affect him most. "You've made this permanent," he said. "I made it transparent." "There's a difference." He stood to leave, pausing at the door. "I never thought you'd escalate like this." I nodded once. "I never thought you'd position me as a risk." He didn't respond, because by the time he understood that the audit would trace everything, not just my access, but his, the timeline had already closed. Some decisions can be negotiated. Others can only be documented. And once documentation circulates, repair becomes harder than prevention. Not impossible, but different. He left without slamming the door. No explosion. Just a quiet realization hanging in the air. It was too late to contain the narrative. The record had already been written. The formal family meeting happened 2 weeks later. Not because I demanded it, because silence had grown too dense to ignore. We gathered at my parents' house on a Saturday afternoon. No extended relatives this time. Just the 4 of us. My mother had prepared coffee, but no dessert. That detail stayed with me. Dessert is for celebration or comfort. This was neither. Daniel arrived on time. That alone signaled something had shifted. We sat around the same kitchen table where years earlier we had agreed, together, on the structure of the trust. The same table where subtle questions about oversight had once hovered in the air. My father cleared his throat. "We need to address what happened," he said carefully. No one raised their voice. No one accused. The forensic report lay printed in the center of the table, bound neatly. 17 instances of Daniel's authorization credentials are documented in clean, unembellished type. Daniel spoke first. "I should have disclosed the interim transfers more clearly," he said. "That was my oversight." Oversight, a softer word than strategy, softer than redirection. My mother looked at him, then at me. "Bella, do you believe this was intentional misuse?" she asked. It was a dangerous question, one that could ignite. I chose precision. "I believe the structure was used in ways it wasn't designed for," I said. "And I believe the lack of disclosure created unnecessary doubt." I didn't say anything about myself. I didn't need to. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't interrupt. My father leaned forward. "The larger issue," he said slowly, "is trust. Not the legal document, the personal one." Silence followed. For months, I had been the quiet variable in whispered conversations, the one whose access had been framed as a potential risk. Now the axis had rotated. "I never accused Bella directly," Daniel said, measured. "You didn't have to," I replied calmly. The words weren't sharp. They were accurate. He met my eyes. "I was concerned about flexibility. I thought she was being rigid." "Rigid about what?" I asked. "Control." There it was. Not money. Control. I let that sit for a moment. "The structure requires control," I said evenly. "That's the purpose of a preservation trust." "But you enjoyed being the gatekeeper," he added. I almost smiled, not in amusement but in clarity. "I never denied access," I said. "I required documentation." He looked away first. My mother folded her hands. "I think," she said quietly, "that some of this began before the money." She wasn't wrong. This wasn't just about transactions. It was about roles. For years, Daniel had been the visible leader, the persuasive one, the voice people lean toward. I had been the infrastructure, invisible until challenged. The confrontation didn't escalate because there was nothing left to expose. The report had already done that. There were no secrets left to unveil. Just interpretation. My father finally spoke the sentence that closed it. From now on, all discretionary beneficiary transfers require third-party authorization. Not directed at anyone, just implemented. Permanent. Daniel nodded stiffly. I nodded once. No victory. No defeat. Just redefinition. As the meeting ended, Daniel paused near the doorway. I didn't expect you to push back like that, he said quietly. I didn't push, I replied. I documented. And documentation doesn't shout. It stands. People expect transformation to look dramatic. A new haircut, a sharper tone, a colder demeanor. Mine looked almost identical from the outside. I still work in financial operations. I still carry my black leather portfolio. I still answer questions calmly. But something fundamental has changed. I no longer confuse quiet with compliance. In the months after the meeting, the family dynamic recalibrated slowly. Not perfectly, not without awkward pauses, but structurally. Quarterly independent reviews became routine. Transaction summaries were distributed automatically by the third-party administrator. No one asked me to clarify tone anymore. No one joked about me skimming off the top. The jokes stopped first. Then the glances. Then the hesitation before including me in financial conversations. Trust, once documented, becomes less negotiable. Daniel and I didn't become estranged, but we became accurate. He no longer frames questions as subtle implications. If he wants flexibility, he says so directly. If he disagrees with the structure, he argues policy, not character. And I respond the same way. We don't orbit the same way we used to. There's less performance, more distance, but also more clarity. The most unexpected shift wasn't external. It was internal. For years, I believed that being the stable one meant absorbing doubt quietly. That if I just explained clearly enough, calmly enough, long enough, the misunderstanding would dissolve. What I learned is this: explanation without boundaries invites repetition. Documentation with boundaries ends it. I don't feel triumphant. I don't feel vindicated. I feel aligned with my own standards. When people now describe me as meticulous, it doesn't sound like criticism. It sounds like recognition. When someone says I'm careful, I no longer rush to soften it with humor. Careful is accurate. Careful protection. Careful prevents narrative from outrunning fact. The biggest difference, though, is subtler. I no longer wait to see how I'm being perceived before I act. If a structure needs reinforcement, I reinforce it. If transparency is required, I implement it. Not defensively, preemptively. There's a calm that comes from knowing you don't need to defend your integrity publicly ever again. Because it's been audited, verified, recorded. And here's something I didn't expect. I don't resent Daniel. I understand him better. Pressure reveals priorities. In his case, opportunity outran disclosure. In mine, structure outran suggestion. We both acted in alignment with who we are. The difference is that I stopped allowing my alignment to be interpreted as weakness. I am still steady, still quiet, still observant, but now, when I walk into a room, I don't feel invisible. I feel grounded. And grounded people don't need to raise their voice to shift the room. If you had asked me a year ago what this story would be about, I might have said money, or fairness, or sibling rivalry. But it wasn't really about any of those things. It was about narrative, about how quickly a suggestion can replace evidence when it's repeated calmly enough, about how easily the quiet, competent person becomes the convenient focal point for doubt, and about what happens when you stop arguing your integrity and start documenting it. I never screamed. I never exposed anyone theatrically. I never humiliated my brother. I followed the structure we had all agreed to, and when that structure was tested, I reinforced it. That's the part people don't talk about enough. Quiet dominance isn't control. It isn't revenge. It isn't a public takedown. It's the alignment between your values and your actions, especially when you're being misunderstood. For months, I felt the subtle weight of implication. The glances, the softened jokes, the careful questions were framed as concern. I could have fought each one individually. Instead, I addressed the foundation. Because when you remove ambiguity, you remove oxygen from rumors. And here's what I learned most clearly. If someone is comfortable questioning your integrity in public, They should be comfortable reviewing their own in the same light. Not angrily, not spitefully, equally. Documentation doesn't shout. It doesn't humiliate. It doesn't dramatize. It simply exists. And when it exists clearly enough, it reshapes the room without you having to raise your voice. Today, my relationships are quieter, but more honest. My role in the family is no longer invisible. It's defined. And most importantly, I no longer feel the need to defend myself in spaces where I've already done the work to protect myself. So I'll leave you with this. Have you ever been subtly positioned as the problem when you were actually the structure holding everything together? If you have, I'd love to know. Did you argue your innocence, or did you document your truth?
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.